All right, I'm here with Issandr El Amrani, who's in Cairo. I'm Blake Hounshell. I'm the managing editor of Foreign Policy magazine. Issandr can introduce himself. I'm in Doha for the moment, which is apparently the epicenter of the Arab Revolution that is sweeping the region. And Issandr has been living and working in Cairo in North Africa for, I don't know, maybe a decade. And this has been a really exciting and exhilarating time for him, I know. So, Issandr, why don't you tell us what you've been up to?
Yeah, thanks, Blake. I'm Issandr El Amrani. I run the Arabist blog at arabist.net. And I've been a journalist based in Cairo, but mostly working on North Africa as a journalist and also as a researcher. I used to be the North Africa analyst for International Crisis Group. Came to Cairo in 2000, and it's been like Blake says, it's been an exciting time. I was actually in Tunis earlier in January. I went to Tunis immediately after the fall of Ben Ali and planned to spend a couple of weeks there, but I had to interrupt my trip because of what was happening in Egypt. I returned to Egypt on Friday, January 28th, in time for the big fight that evening. And it's been just completely overwhelming. I think people like Blake and I, who are journalists, haven't properly slept in a month now.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not normally a tip of the spear kind of guy, but I lived in Cairo in 2005 and 2006, and so I personally just wanted to be there and see what was going on. So I flew to Cairo on the day after they attacked Tahrir Square with camels and horses. And so I was there for about 10 days, and I smartly somehow booked my ticket so that I was there when Mubarak fell. And now I'm back in Doha and just following things on Al Jazeera and Twitter like everyone else. But it's been a riveting time. There's been really no opportunity to rest and reflect about what's going on. It's just one uprising after another, it seems like.
Yeah, perhaps one of the things we should start talking about, and you and I have both lived in Egypt, and for you it was a few years ago, but for such a long time we didn't, none of us were predicting this epidemic of uprising that would happen one after another.
You sound like Les Gelb.
After Tunisia, and it's quite just important perhaps for listeners to remember is that a little over a month ago, people like Blake and I had been writing a lot about the problems in the Arab world, from lack of democracy to socioeconomic inequality, all these issues that have come up to the forefront of one's coverage in the last month. But it was very, very striking. I mean, I think for people like you and I, who had an experience of Egypt as this authoritarian government, but that always seemed able to overwhelm any opposition forces, from the Muslim Brotherhood to the young protesters like the April 6th movement that were behind the uprising, and how this. The spark of Tunisia just completely changed the parameters for what could be expected. I mean, this has been obviously building up in these countries for a long time. It's been about a decade that in America people have talked about the Arab malaise, so to speak, after 9/11, ranging from authoritarianism and its contribution creating extremist Islamic terrorism, and in a sense, it's been even longer in the Arab world. I mean, people didn't wait for 9/11 or some of the more recent problems to talk about this. This has been a 20, 30-year discussion. You might even say that for some people, it's been a discussion ever since 1967, the first kind of calamitous defeat of the Arab regimes, many of which are still more or less in power since then. And there's been, nearly now 30, 40 years of reflection in the Arab world about what's what's wrong with the modes of the methods of governance that you have in this part of the world? What's wrong with some of the social ills, human rights issues, models of economic development? And it all seems, after this long period of gestation, it's all come to the front, and it's really overwhelming. Even for people like us who can professionally monitor this region, it's you had such a period of build-up to this, and then suddenly everything comes out at once, and this is quite humbling for those of us who cover the region.
Yeah, well, I personally, I was there in 2005 in the so-called Arab Spring, and I got a little bit caught up in it and got excited about what was happening. But when I actually started delving into Kifaya, the protest movement that began in late, I think, December 2004 in Egypt, and was an early sort of organizer of demonstrations there. I grew quite cynical after I kept going to demonstrations and seeing the same faces over and over again. It's almost like I could have named all the protesters in Egypt by name at the end of my time there. And Issandr, I'm sure you could do the same. So it seemed like they just didn't really have a message that would resonate across a wide swath of society, or maybe alternatively, people were just too afraid and they didn't believe that going out in the street would make a difference. And that's why I think you're absolutely right. Tunisia was huge in that respect, and people saw, hey, maybe we can get rid of this guy if we just take to the street and demand our rights. I also think that there were some incidents that led up to January 25th that were pretty important. Like some of the attacks on Coptic Christians in Egypt that led to huge crowds that in some cases overwhelmed police forces. And even before that, the parliamentary elections, which were so rigged, and really it became a contest between the ruling party and other members of the ruling party, and it was just so ridiculous. And I think at that point people said, okay, well we don't have really any alternative other than taking our demands to the street. And I think that just led to this explosion that none of us predicted, but all of us sort of warned about in our own way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you have to remember that the Mubarak regime had been in crisis really for a number of years, at least since 2005, and it was accumulation of different things that led to create the atmosphere, the environment where after Tunisia, people realized, hold on a minute, it's possible to topple a dictator. In Egypt, you had not only the same guy in power for over 30 years, but you had more recently a lot of socioeconomic problems, rising inflation. I mean, for the last 3 years, inflation has been double digits in Egypt. You had the price of basic items that was going up in a country where about your typical family spends about 40% of its budget on food items. You had growing disillusionment with the regime. The regime's own reform process that we started seeing from 2002 with the arrival of Gamal Mubarak at the leadership of the National Democratic Party. You had this increasingly visible problem of police brutality and torture. It wasn't new, but it was freshly documented. We saw bloggers like Arabist release torture videos. An extremely unpopular and unusually long-lived interior minister that was just reviled. You had, at the same time, quite high GDP growth. Egypt in the last few years has had a GDP growth of between 5 and 7%, but
not
money
fast enough.
Just not trickling down. And certain people especially people around Gamal Mubarak from the business community, who seem to be getting richer and richer, while the average person, in some cases, was actually getting poorer.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you're completely right that the bombing of the Church of the Two Saints in Alexandria on New Year's Eve was quite a seminal moment in preparation for this, because it really created an outpouring of national unity, of people putting, there'd been for about a year increasingly visible sectarian strains, a lot of disputes in the media between Coptic priests and Muslim intellectuals, disputes about the role of the church, the role of Islam in its relationship to the state, and then suddenly you had this moment of where people said, this has gone too far. I remember just the first week of January, just going to these talks and concerts where there was a real feeling of national unity and of solidarity that I hadn't seen in Egypt for a while, and then that got amplified in Tahrir Square during the protests by a million times. What it appears to be is that Egypt was ready. Egypt maybe has been ready for a number of years for this. It just needed that psychological shift after Tunisia, that protests actually can achieve something, that something is possible.
Yeah, I mean, but as you have pointed out, and a number of people have pointed out, what happened in Tunisia and also in Egypt, it wouldn't have succeeded without the sympathy of the army and the unwillingness of the army in both cases to shoot on fellow citizens. I was told a story by a French journalist who was in Tunisia, who said that the General Amr, the top general in Tunisia, actually was ordered by Ben Ali at one point to fire on protesters. And he said he wouldn't do it. And Ben Ali ripped off the epaulette off his shoulder and said, "You're not a soldier." And that was really what sparked the coup there. I don't know if that story is true or not. I can't vouch for it. But I think it's indicative of, it's a little more complex than simply a popular revolution sweeping away these regimes. And that's why I think from here on out, it's going to be a lot harder in a place, obviously, like Libya, which doesn't have much of a real army, and Gaddafi really rules through, his militias run by his sons. And it seemed like they're willing to fight, to the last bullet, and it's going to be like a kind of like a Hitler-like bunker defense until the bitter end. So I worry that we're getting a little too optimistic here, and from here on out, it's just going to be a bloodbath across the region.
Sure. I mean, I think Tunisia and Egypt are quite different in that respect from Libya, because in Tunisia and Egypt you had quite there's a modern state that's been established, that's been built upon modern professional armed forces that exist, and they were essentially confronted with a choice. I think you're completely right about Tunisia. I think one of the turning points for me, I don't know whether the anecdote that you told is accurate or not. I've heard similar things, but I do remember a turning point in early January when the army intervened to defend a group of lawyers who were protesting, I think in Sfax, Tunisia's second city, and actually intervened to protect them from the police that was attacking them. And that, as people told me when I was there a month ago, was psychologically was very important. That people had the feeling that the army would not just stand by and let the police repress the protests. And obviously, by January 14th, it was over. I mean, there were a few hours between 4 p.m. Tunisia time and 8 p.m. when Ben Ali left, where basically he received an ultimatum from the army. There's a lot of speculation about how it took place exactly. Some people in Tunisia are convinced that basically the United States, or perhaps also other Western countries, contacted the military and assured them of support if they moved against Ben Ali. We don't know whether that's true. Obviously, there was also parallel contacts between the military and the United States in Egypt, where they have a long-standing relationship, and public and private pressure on the military not to intervene against the protesters. I'm not, I'm quite sure that that was part of the message from Washington. But beyond that, also, were these institutions, military institutions, really willing anyway, whether there's Western pressure or not, to take it to the step of an intervention against civilians, to risk basically civil war? And you have to remember that these institutions have a sense of mission of not only national security and protecting their countries from outside aggression, but also a sense that they are pillar institutions, and that the alternative to basically even passively taking the side of the protest movement was to risk civil war, to risk state collapse. And in Libya, that seems to be what has happened. Some parts of the army are fighting for Gaddafi, others have defected. Gaddafi never built up a modern state in the sense that Tunisia and Egypt did over the last 50 years and longer. He never really institutionalized the country. It was kind of like Iraq in a sense. It was a very, it's a one-man show. Iraq, Saddam, obviously.
Well, I think that's actually, one of the sort of danger signs for these regimes is when they really start to narrow their power base as they get, as these rulers get older. They seem to like to dole out key positions to their friends, their family. In Tunisia, it was the Trabelsi clan, the first lady's family, who basically looted the country. In Egypt, it was Gamal Mubarak and his business friends who were seen as looting the country. In Yemen, which is seeing, it's probably one of the next countries to go down. He's got his different relatives, running different aspects of his security apparatus. Libya, very well known. Basically, it seems like every son has a different piece of the, security state there. Do you see other countries in the region having that problem, that narrowing of the base, that's going to ultimately come and bite them?
I've thought from the very beginning of these uprisings that the countries that would be most vulnerable would actually be based on how long the ruler has been in place. Mubarak 30 years, Ben Ali 23 years, Gaddafi 41 years. I think in Yemen, if you include the time before the reunification of Yemen, it's at least also 25 years for Salah. That's based on that criteria. I haven't seen that much yet, but I've been looking at North Sudan. North Sudan, I think, is quite vulnerable because not only has Bashir been in place since the mid '80s, I believe. You also have obviously his regime has committed atrocities, has isolated himself internationally, has basically lost half of the country and lost for a good part of the ruling elite. It's responsible for basically the partition, the coming partition of Sudan, which not a lot of people in the north support. It's quite vulnerable in many respects. And I think those countries with leaders that have been around for a shorter period of time. Morocco is one example. Also, Morocco is different because it is more liberal than obviously a place like Libya, certainly, and a place.
Right, and the king can just cashier the government and kind of stand above it.
Yeah, the king can do that to
now.
a certain extent. Although we've seen in Bahrain, there's a limited element, and the composition of the country, whether the regime relies a lot on either sectarian splits or on tribalism. Makes a difference,
It's also hard to fire your uncle. If your uncle's the prime minister, you can't say, Uncle Khalifa, it's time for you to go after 40 years, right?
Of course, yeah.
These guys don't get better with experience. They're not like wines that develop a better taste over the years. They get more brutal, they get nastier, they get more out of touch with reality. So sorry we got disconnected there. I want to move on to Saudi Arabia, which it seems like the elephant in the room. We don't really know much about Saudi Arabia. It's a pretty opaque place. They don't allow a lot of investigative journalism there. But like all these other places, there's a Facebook group, or one or two Facebook groups actually, that are set up and calling for protests. They've got a list of pretty liberal demands for political reform. King Abdullah just landed back in the country after a long stint in convalescing in the United States and Morocco. He landed on Wednesday and announced a multi-billion-dollar economic, basically a bribe package. No real political reform to speak of. But a lot of people in Washington and I'm sure oil markets around the world are freaking out about the possibility that you're going to see some kind of unrest in Saudi Arabia. Most of the oil comes from the Eastern Province, which is heavily Shiite, and there's been years of discontent there. Usually it gets pretty handled pretty quietly. But March 11th is this big demo supposedly that's scheduled. We don't know how many people are actually going to turn out. But there are a lot of people around the world that are watching Saudi Arabia very closely right now.
Yeah, absolutely. Saudi Arabia is a big mystery. I mean, I think also some other points to remember is that you have this population that's I think over 60% is 18 years old or younger.
Yeah.
You have, but you have a ruling elite or the ruling family, and the king himself, who I think is in his mid-80s. You have also another important thing, actually, in comparison to Egypt and Tunisia and Libya. These were all countries that were facing succession crises.
Yeah.
Nominally republics, but where a member of the family was everyone thought that in Egypt, Gamal Mubarak, in Tunisia it was Sakhr Matari, his son-in-law. Ben Ali's son-in-law. In Libya, it was a competition between the various sons of Gaddafi. And you have a succession crisis coming up in Saudi Arabia too, where we're not sure yet. A lot of people talk, I think, about Prince Nayef, but
he's the interior minister.
Mm-hmm. But again, an elderly member of the family. There's been talk about, will it skip a generation and go to the 60-something-year-old generation? But you have this real disconnect between the bulk of the population and the rulers. And as much as I saw that it was announced that Saudi Arabia would be distributing basically about $2,000 a head to come buy social peace. Money is not everything. Saudi Arabia also is not like the UAE or a place like Qatar or with a small population. It has a population of some 26 million and big, despite being a very wealthy country.
Big disparities.
You have big disparities. You do have poor Saudi Arabians, and not just among the Shia population, also among the Sunni population, and you have a strong religious undercurrents that, as hard as it is to believe, some of them are more radical than the royal family. Some of them, while not necessarily being radical, are critical of the royal family because they feel they haven't, because of Saudi Arabia's alliance with the United States, or because of the incredibly lavish lifestyle of the royal family and the top 15,000 princes. I mean, there are real problems, and as much as unlike Egypt, Saudi Arabia is a country that you have to, and it's really, sometimes I think people forget about it too much. This is a country that went to basically a nomadic pastoralist society with a few merchant towns only 80 years ago. To what it is today. So incredible amounts of modernization in a very short amount of time. that creates a tremendous amount of potential for political turmoil. And the Saudis have actually historically, largely perhaps because of money, been able to handle it fairly well, even though there were close calls like the 1979 takeover of Mecca by Islamist insurgents. And we don't know to what extent Saudi has that flexibility to adapt. And some of the things that the liberals that are asking for are contested by other opposition groups. Things like women's rights, things like basically liberal or more progressive ideas about how to control, how to run the country. There isn't. I don't think that there is, to my knowledge, the same consensus over reform that you had, let's say, among the Egyptian opposition.
No, I think that's right, and there's been really less time to develop that kind of consensus. And what I'm seeing in sort of a limited way on Twitter and Facebook is that you're starting to see these youth, kids, whatever you want to call them, starting to have this political awakening a little bit. They're seeing what's going on in Egypt. There's even a hashtag called Egypt Defect Saudi Arabia or Egypt Defect SA. Where people are debating what kind of impact Mubarak's fall is having or will have on Saudi Arabia, and that's something entirely new as far as I understand. These sort of disorganized people on the internet, which is really probably the only real public sphere in Saudi Arabia. I'm sure there's a lot of political discussion that goes on in inside like diwaniyas or people's house salons and among elites. But this is really a new phenomenon, and it's not clear that there's any sort of way or any process or method that the royal family has to absorb this kind of thing. There's a history in Saudi Arabia of people making these sort of open petitions to the king, open letters that they publish in these newspapers. But this is an altogether different phenomenon, and it's not the same kind of controlled begging the ruler to make these top-down changes.
And it's not clear. I mean, from what I've seen, what the demands are, what the possible alternatives are, and I think at this stage it's more of a petitioning movement in a sense that people aren't talking, or for the most part, they're not talking about toppling the Al Saud dynasty or King Abdullah. They're trying to put pressure on, perhaps those parts of the royal family that are more inclined to carry out reforms and to push them in that direction. And it begs the question, of course, this is a question that we Middle East watchers have been asking for a while, is does it make a difference if your political system is a monarchy rather than a republic? And the trend so far had been that the monarchies could take, had more flexibility and more legitimacy, because if you're a republic, the idea is that you shouldn't have hereditary successions. You shouldn't have you should have more of a more balance of powers among the different branches of government.
Well, ironically, by pretending to be democratic, the republics have actually probably accelerated their own downfalls. The monarchies, at least, they don't really pretend. And another thing about these Gulf monarchies is that, and I think it's true as Morocco as well, there is a historical legitimacy to a lot of them. Some people complain, well, the British just installed these families, but in Qatar, where I live, the Al Thanis have been really the predominant family dating back to the 19th century and probably before then. So there really isn't, that I'm aware of, any sort of question about are they the ones who deserve to be the ruling family or not. That the Al Saud family in Saudi Arabia, took control of the country and unified it by force of arms. And they made this sort of grand bargain with the Wahhabi clerics that they wouldn't mess too much with the religious sphere as long as the clerics didn't mess too much into politics. So you have these kind of, ruling bargains across the region that aren't fundamentally threatened, it seems to me, except for maybe the case of Bahrain, where you have, a state that's been, fairly liberal compared to other countries in the region, and that may have proven to be, its undoing because it's a minority regime that's trying to rule over an angry Shiite population right now.
Mm-hmm. One interesting talking to Egyptian friends over the last few days is that there's a lot of anxiety about Saudi Arabia's role in Egypt in other places. That Saudi Arabia favored the status quo. I mean, obviously, we now know through the media that King Abdullah and the Saudi ruling elite was very angry with Barack Obama for its stance towards Egypt. That he was a supporter of Hosni Mubarak till the last moment.
Yeah.
I think, and one of the big questions that people are asking here is Saudi Arabia going to sabotage our revolution? Is it going to use its money and influence, whether it's over Islamist movement or over the military in Egypt or the regime elements, to make sure that things don't change too much? Because this pattern of monarchies, being supposedly more stable, more adaptable, more able to deliver certain reforms, limited reforms, may change if the political transition process that takes place in Tunisia and in Egypt, I think, and more long term in a place like Libya, really generates a new kind of social bargain, a more democratic type of government in those countries, because then the Saudi Arabias and the Qatars and the UAE and so on are going to look a lot less like the success, the way they've looked so far, like the more successful in Arab societies. Mm-hmm. They're going to be under a lot more pressure, and I know people here are really quite scared, especially because there's been this Egypt, even while the governments were quite close to each other, there's been among the wider society a kind of resentment of Saudi Arabia as having usurped Egypt's role in the Arab world and having basically won the Arab civil war that started back in the 60s with Nasser, when Nasser and I think King Fahd at the time or Faisal perhaps, were rivals for influence over the rest of the country. I mean, what we have with this revolutionary movement in the Arab world is in a sense a new pan-Arabism that's a lot more, that's based on values of democratization, of accountability, of rejecting this the idea of the Za'in, the strongman that's dominated over most Middle Eastern societies since decolonization. And if it's successful, if that project is successful, I think it will challenge the countries like Saudi Arabia, both diplomatically, but also in terms of their own legitimacy.
Yeah, but if you can reassure your Egyptian friends by pointing out that the Saudis, in their attempts to intervene in other countries in the region, have pretty miserably failed. Look at what happened to their clients in Lebanon after the so-called Cedar Revolution there. Look at what happened with their attempts to wean Syria over into the so-called moderate camp. And look what happened in Iraq. They were backing Iyad Alawi and he lost. And now there's basically no diplomatic relations between Saudi Arabia and Iraq. So if it's any consolation, the Saudis are losing influence too. And it's really this new sort of block of Turkey, Qatar, and Iran that really are sort of driving foreign policy in the region, in my view.
Yeah, I wouldn't underestimate. I mean, Saudi has had a quiet checkbook diplomacy that's not very visible, but that has been very effective over the last 20, 30 years. And to me, it seems that they're less interested in particular outcomes as coming together to agreements, and they're quite flexible about the type of agreement. I mean, I think we see that in Lebanon, where Saudi went from its pro March 14th position in 2005 to its current position, where it's trying to triangulate between Syria and March 8th and March 14th, and the outcome is still, basically acceptable to the ruling family. Its key interests have been salvaged. It's true that the Saudis are quite concerned about Iran and Iran's spread of influence, but again, the Saudis have no fixed alliances, as far as I can see. They're more interested in outcomes that preserve their own, obviously their internal stability, and I think they're placed in the region, and they've been quite good actually at balancing people off against each other, at buying loyalty, and adapting to the evolution of things. And you have to remember that the Saudis are also usually benefit from the support of most Western powers. I mean, the fact is they have the most spare production capacity for oil in the world, and this gives them tremendous power and support. I mean, no one, I think, in any Western capital or in the world banking system, and also in places like China and Russia, wants to see instability.
Well, the Russians might. The Russians.
You think the Russians might?
They like high oil prices. They like to see, because they have high extraction costs. They don't mind to see Saudi Arabia's position as a swing producer undermined. But I think you make an excellent point. I mean, the Saudis certainly reminded the world this week, of their power when they came out and said they would pump to make up for the shortfall from Libya. And I think Obama seems to be riding this wave of Arab uprisings for now. But as we get closer to the 2012 election, he's going to start to think about what kind of effect oil prices are going to have on his re-election chances. And I imagine there's kind of a push and pull going on in the administration now. I think prices for Brent oil got up to close to 120 this week, and if things continue as they are going, speculation could drive the price of oil a lot higher. It seems like the sky's the limit. So it's not even clear Obama could put the toothpaste back in the tube, so to speak, but he might start to show a lot less enthusiasm for what's going on in the Arab world as this drags on.
Yeah, and we also have, and this is a concern for the United States and the EU. The message, that I've been getting coming to countries like Egypt that are in the middle of a transition process is yes, on the one hand, a real transition is desired, and this is the message that the White House has given, certainly towards Egypt, and that they're ready to support that transition. But at the same time, I saw the Under Secretary of State for Political Affairs a few days ago, Bill Burns, and listening to him at this press conference, I also detected a real sense of concern about basically these transitions are stable, and this is the balancing act. I think there's a real concern about prolonged instability in the region, as because the fact is, in Tunisia and in Egypt, we still have a lot of former regime personalities in positions of influence and power.
Yeah, Mubarak's prime minister is still the prime minister.
Of course, yeah, Mubarak's last prime minister is still the prime minister. He's the man who used to call Mubarak his spiritual father. You still have the the same foreign minister, a bunch of other people, the generals themselves. I mean, the head of the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces that's now ruling Egypt.
All appointed by Mubarak, right?
Excuse me?
They're all appointed by Mubarak, no?
Yeah, all of them were appointed by Mubarak. A whole generation of generals in Egypt that were, rose to their ranks under Mubarak, and it's still you can still make the argument that in Egypt you still don't quite have yet a revolution. What you've had is a coup, and there's a lot of anxiety about which direction the military is going to take that. How much democratization you're really going to have, and when you see, and it's going to be, I think, a choice for Western countries too, about to what extent do you push for our style of democracy, and to what extent are you going to be trying to rush a transition so that things are under control again and as quickly as possible. And it's not clear. I think intellectually the State Department and the EU have to do a lot of house clearing, a lot of meditation over their past policies, especially over the last decade, and how they're going to approach this new Arab world that's emerging.
Mm-hmm.
There's been, especially in the United States, because of the Bush administration's for the Agenda for Freedom and all the rhetoric he put out there,
mm-hmm.
There's been this kind of schizophrenia about, yes, we're for democracy, but we also have interest. I mean, of course, that's normal. That's just the way the world works. But and it's still not clear, I think, my feeling is that these countries that have a lot of influence over the course of events here still haven't worked out their new strategy.
No, I think that's absolutely right. Jeffrey Feltman, the Assistant Secretary of State for Near East Affairs, was in Doha yesterday, and I saw him give a little town hall. And he wasn't ready to say U.S. foreign policy has fundamentally shifted. We're tossing these regimes overboard and getting with the Shab. But, what he did say is, look, we're looking to seize opportunities for change. We've been, sort of quietly talking to these regimes for a long time and, talking out of both sides of our mouth. That's my word, not his. And now we see an opportunity to get some of our priorities, for reform accomplished. But, that had the tone of saying, well, maybe if the window of opportunity closes, then we'll start to shift in a different direction. And I would, for instance, we talked about Saudi Arabia. I don't want to get into Palestine and Israel, but if things start heating up there are going to be some real dilemmas for the Obama administration, and I expect that they will confront some choices about whether to support the Palestinian street or whether to sort of quietly watch Mahmoud Abbas hand in hand with Israel cracking down on people.
Yeah, I mean, anyone who's been reading my blog knows I have quite strong views on Israel-Palestine and how wrong U.S. policy has been towards that. And the American discourse still has a huge blind spot on this. And you can just see, I think, one of Thomas Friedman's more recent columns where he talks about oil and how that America's going to have to reconsider its oil addiction and how concern over oil availability has been a huge impediment to come for democracy policies in the U.S. But he only talks about oil. The other thing has been Israel.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the fact is, the U.S. has been supportive of the Mubarak regime and limited in what it could do in its relationship with the Mubarak regime because of its concern for Israel's safety. In my opinion, a misplaced concern, because it's not like Egypt, as soon as Mubarak is gone, is going to start invading Israel. It's not in a position to do so militarily, economically, and politically.
Yeah.